Heigh ho! 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 It's home from work we go. Heigh ho! Heigh ho! Heigh ho! Heigh ho! Heigh ho!
So, how do dwarves make beer? I mean, you could say they just trade for barley or wheat or something like that, but obviously that's not a good thing if you want a sustainable dwarf colony. So they have to grow something from which they can extract sugars and then ferment. And in order to grow something, they have to find a suitable plant. And really, it's not a plant, but the only real option is mushrooms or some form of fungus. And the problem with fungus is it doesn't really store glucose, carbs, and starches, which are things that you can easily extract sugar from. So we need to look for glycogen, which is closer to an animal protein than it is to cellulose. And in order to grow this, we need a substrate that contains both cellulose and lignin. If we had access to cellulose, we wouldn't be having this problem. So, how do we get plant stuff? Well, in a cave, your options are really, really limited. Because photosynthesis is not possible, there is really nothing that the plants can split water molecules to make monosaccharides like glucose. So you want to find something that can take the sunlight or gather the energy to split the water some other way. Generally speaking, this is where you would make up a fantasy plant, but if you wanted to keep it very grounded and realistic, you would have to look at something on the surface. The only things on the surface that you can harvest in a cave really are roots, and that's from tall trees that grow their roots down deep. So you make a root farming chamber. Well, you have to have the right kind of roots. Not every root grows very quickly, and the older a tree gets, the less it really grows its roots. Especially when they're young, they grow very quickly, but when they're older, they don't. So, looking through the varieties of trees, I basically came to the conclusion that pine was the best because it both grew deep, relatively speaking, and also quickly. And specifically the loblolly pine. That's a hard word to say. Its roots don't grow as deep as other pine trees, but if you were to incentivize the growth of the taproot, you could get it 20 feet plus below the surface. After that, you have to incentivize the growth of the roots using water and soil, which again you can actually kind of become self-sustaining at this point by creating soil from your waste of your mushrooms and the substrate you make. And then you trim the lateral roots, which grow at about 2 to 4 feet per year per root. That's the ones that are the main trunks that grow out sideways on the tree. And that is a sustainable-ish plant. Now, all we need to then make a functional substrate is nitrogen from bats, bone meal, which you can get from the bats as well, and a little urine, specifically for urea. So, but not a lot. It'll kill the shit out of it. It makes it toxic if you just piss all over the pot. So, you have a substrate, your mushrooms are growing, but how do you get drunk? Well, first you pick a shroom. The oyster mushroom is basically the best choice. It has a super high amount of glycogen compared to other mushrooms, and it grows very easily in the substrate that we have. So you blend them, boil them, you make wort. Kind of. You actually don't have enough sugar to ferment. If you were to take just this soup and ferment it, it basically has no sugars, and that would cause you to have a very weak beer. So we need to find more sugars. Well, how do we find more sugars in our current environment? We gather some of the colonized substrate. That is to say, before the mushroom grows, the slurry that the mushroom deposits and starts injecting into the substrate, we want to gather that, and then we want to use cheesecloth or any kind of cloth really to pull the enzyme free by basically teabagging it. As funny as that sounds, you just kind of sit there. It's called steeping, and you go until you basically only have this enzyme. Once you have that enzyme, you then can take it and you can put it into a extraction mixture with a pulped up root mix. You take the roots that you have, you turn them into a powder, or you shred them, and then you put them in basically warm water and barely covering the roots, and then you add this enzyme and you keep it heated for somewhere in the ballpark of I think it was 48 hours, and then you get basically a sugary water. That's not it though, right? So we have the sugar water, we have the oyster shroom broth. now we need to find some yeast. Well, yeast is not really naturally occurring in any fungus. Yeast is pretty much only yeast, and there's really not much you can do with that. So we need to find yeast, and for this, I actually ran into a barrier. You basically either have to be very lucky and somehow have yeast bacteria in your cave, or you need to go outside. And you take your root juice, you put it outside, and you just let it sit there. Hopefully the bacteria finds the root juice, and if it does, you'll get a bubbling. You'll get not foaming so much, but you'll just see bubbles inside the liquid. If you don't, you have to toss the whole mixture and try again. But once you have that bubbling, you now have yeast-infused root juice. And once you have that, you can pour it out and dry it into flakes. And just adding more of the root juice to it later will cause it to multiply and give you a larger sample. So now you're good. Now you have your yeast. The other way you could preserve it, which most of you people probably know, is the sourdough starter. But we lack the resources to maintain sourdough starters. We don't have wheat, barley. We would have to be feeding root pulp into it constantly, like a root flour of some variety, which is something we can do, but we don't want to be using all of our roots to make kind of stuff like that. So now we have yeast. Now we have our oyster pulp, our oyster mushroom pulp. We also have our root juice. Well, now you just ferment it, basically. Keeping it at a warm temperature, you put it in a bottle, you don't seal it, you want it to be able to breathe, and then you let it sit for, I think it was like 12 days minimum, and then you end up with a alcoholic drink. And you could then continue to distill it to create some kind of whiskey or brandy or whatever, but it ends up... But there it is, it's drinkable. Now, you might think that because we basically effectively made this alcohol out of the root sugar, we could just do the root sugar and make that's it, right? Two things about that. One is it would be very poorly, it would taste bad. The other thing is it's not made out of mushrooms and you're a fucking dwarf. Why would you do that? Anyway, thank you for coming to my TED Talk.